Well, good morning, church. Who's happy to be here with me today? I, too, am really excited, and for those that are here in service and watching online, and as Beth said, we have been in this message called The Good Life, where we're looking at what it really means to live the good life. And as we've talked about in this series so far, lots of different ideas and definitions about living the good life. But what we're finding as we go through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is that the good life is really about one thing and one thing only. And that leads to our major theme through this whole series, and I'll just put it on the side screens, and that is simply this, is that living the good life is the result of a Christ-centered life. That's the one thing when we look at the good life, it's really the result of a Christ-centered life. And what we've seen so far as we've gone through these two books is that this Christ-centered life that we live, when Jesus is at the center of our life, some really amazing things start to happen. First and foremost, that we start to mature and grow in our faith. That's kind of a lifelong journey. So we saw the good life is really a maturing faith for every aspect of our lives. And then after that, we looked at how a connected life is really a good life for us, that we need each other as we journey. This faith journey isn't just on our own. We do that together. And then Becca, a few weeks ago, gave us this idea of a Christ-centered life is also a refined life, that God takes everything we experience in our lives and he refines us through that process. And then last week, Scott told us and talked to us about this Christ-centered life being a holy life. And what he was talking about was how we can be in community, not away from community, but how when we engage in community, we can actually, through Christ, be an influence on the community, not the community influencing us. And so this is where we've been up until this point. And so today what I want to talk about when I come to a Christ-centered life is living a quiet life. And in order to do this, we're going to take a look at just two verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. If you like to follow along with your Bibles, you can do that. Two simple verses. And then also they'll be up on the side screens as we go through this as well. But as we start today talking about the quiet life, when you think of, what comes to mind when you think of places or situations where you need to be quiet? Anything come to mind there? I think the number one, we heard it in the first service, was library, right? I mean, I've been shushed in more libraries than you can imagine in terms of just you got to be quiet in libraries. Also, what are some other ones? You know, museums, they say if you go to a museum, certain ones, you should be pretty quiet. How about a movie theater? Have you ever sat in a movie and had somebody talking to you the whole time when they're right next to you? You're supposed to be quiet in movies. Church service? Yeah, you guys want to be quiet in the church service, right? I have one that is pretty amazing, and it all kind of came out of the COVID era, and that is sort of the etiquette with Zoom meetings. I don't know that we just, when we went into Zoom meetings, especially when it came to business and doing work, it was the wild, wild west for a while in terms of how people conducted themselves on Zoom meetings, right? I remember I was on this training call with all these different people, and this woman was in her bedroom doing the call, and all of a sudden, her husband comes walking out of the bathroom and just taking a shower. No lie. Fortunately, he had a towel on, but it was like, okay, well, who does that, right? It's like, you are in a meeting here, right? The best one was, though, that I was in another meeting with a kind of a collaboration of these different organizations. And this guy that was on that was facilitating the meeting. And so this one other guy listening didn't have his mute on, and his wife in the background goes, "How long is this meeting going to take?" And his response was, "Well, the way this guy's talking, we're going to be here all night." True story. And then somebody gets worse. Somebody goes, "Jim, you're unmuted." And his response was, "Oh, shoot." But he didn't say shoot. Serious. Zoom etiquette, I tell you. And then the other one, so I heard this too, about just thinking about places where you're quiet. They have quiet retreats where you could actually go for 10 days and not speak. You know what that is to me? Hell on earth, right? I cannot imagine not speaking for 10 days. I mean, for some of you, you might think me not speaking for 10 days is heaven on earth. I don't know. Fact of the matter is, there's all kinds of scenarios and situations where we should be quiet and live quietly, but interestingly enough, Apostle Paul tells us as a Christ follower that we're called to live our entire life quietly. In fact, I want to start out and just read you the 2 verses of what Paul says about this idea of living quietly. And it'll be on the side screens as well. But this is what it says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 11 through 12. It says, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now, these are interesting words, I think, that come from the Apostle Paul, because Paul did not strike me as somebody that should be quiet, that would be quiet. Talks about him standing up for his faith. He's in synagogues. He's in city government offices. Even at the risk of his own safety, he's talking. He's out there. But interestingly, he tells us, and it feels kind of weird to me when I read this on the surface, he's telling us to live a quiet life. And the question is, aren't we supposed to be a little bit more outgoing when it comes to our faith, to share the gospel, to share the good news, to stand up and stand out for our faith? The answer is yes, we should. And what we're going to find in this text and the rest of this time together is Paul's definition of the quiet life, of how he defines it, is probably for most of us not the quiet that we're thinking in that definition. And so I want to spend some time for the rest of this time defining what Paul means when he says living a quiet life. And let me just start with this big idea, and that is simply this, is that we can make the greatest noise in this world when we live quietly. Greatest noise that we can make in this world is living quietly. And let me just give you a quick setup. Recap, Thessalonica was where Paul started this church, and he was getting some great traction. The church was doing pretty well, but very quickly there was opposition that was happening to him from the gospel message, both from Jews and Gentiles, so much so that he had to get out of town for his own safety. And so he left way earlier, apparently, than he really wanted to. And so he wanted to stay connected to the church. And so he sent some people to see how that church is doing. Once he had moved on, he was in Corinth when he wrote these letters to the Thessalonians. And he was getting reports back from people like Timothy saying what was going on there. And for the most part, the church was doing pretty well. Their love for one another was growing. They were maturing in their faith. They were kind of, Paul was saying, hey, we've been bragging about what you guys are doing there to other churches because you guys are great. But as he goes along, because it's human nature and it's people, church is made up of people, there started to be some things that were a little bit off base there. One of those is that everybody believed right then and there that Jesus was coming back. So some of the Christians stopped sort of living and engaging in work and life, and we're kind of sitting around, if you will, waiting at the bus stop to get picked up. And so in that idleness, there started to be a little bit of people getting involved in other people's business. So in chapter 4 of the text I just read, Paul sends them some encouragement to sort of keep them on track, and also in that defines what living a quiet life requires. And so the 3 things we're going to look at today in terms of what it requires to live a quiet life are these 3 things. It's that we have to calm down, we have to keep out, and we have to focus in. So let's talk about those for a minute. The first one is this, is that we have to calm down. The first thing that we're going to see when you look at the text, when Paul uses the word quietly, the translation isn't to not say anything and to zip it. It's not that. Really, the translation to quiet he's talking about is to be in a state of peace, to be in a state of calmness. See, what Paul is mirroring is what God wants and intends for every single one of us, is that we can experience and live a life of peace that is not tethered to our circumstances. Whether they're good or bad, what God says is, and what Paul is saying is, you can experience peace in your life that is not dependent on your circumstances. How many of you would like to have more peace in your life and calm in your life that's not connected to your circumstances? I think everybody would, right? Because that, my friends, is the good life, that we could live a life of peace that isn't dictated by those things. See, we can have that, but what Paul is saying here is that we have some ownership of creating the peace in our life. God promises a peace that's beyond human understanding, but there's a component of it that we have responsibility for living a calm or being in a state of calm and peace in our lives. In fact, if you notice the first words, there's a word in verse 11 that is really important in his encouragement. He says, make it your ambition to live a quiet life, to live quietly. That word ambition is important because ambition is described as goal setting, focus, strategy, work. So what he's saying is we have to work and make it our goal and our focus to live a peaceful life. It just doesn't come naturally. And I think there's some things that universally all of us experience in our lives, everyday lives that are challenging and that are peace barriers in our life that we have to constantly work at. Let me just quickly give you 4, and this is not exhaustive, but one of the big peace barriers in our life is busyness. Anybody busy? Anybody busy? You don't ever hear too many people when you ask them how they're doing and go, wow, I wish I was busier. You ever hear that? That's not too common, is it? I was talking to a gentleman, a friend of mine, just a couple days ago at Kids Camp who's retired, and he goes, I'm busier than I'm now than I was when I'm working. I don't know how I ever found time to work. I'm so busy. The truth is that we have such great opportunity in our lives with so much stuff, but the reality is so many of us, we just cram more and more into our lives. We heard that term, FOMO, fear of missing out. You've heard that term before. We suffer from FOMO. There's actually another FOMO that I think more people are suffering with in the reality of busyness. It's being frantic, overstimulated, maxed out, and overscheduled. I think that's the FOMO that a lot of people are experiencing in their life. And here's the thing, you can't have peace in your life if you're living your life in a hurry. The second one that I think is a peace barrier is worry and anxiety. It doesn't take much, I think you would agree, to have things to worry about and have anxiety about things. Think about it, you just watch the news for 5 minutes, and then there's worry. Every time I watch the news or look at stuff, I'm wanting to go, oh, Jesus, when are you coming back, right? Because there's a lot to worry about in our lives. I love the story of the man who put an ad in the paper. And he says, I'm going to pay a salary of $200,000 for somebody who would worry for me. And believe it or not, he had a guy answer the ad. And so he hires this guy, $200,000 to do his worrying. Gets about 2 weeks into the arrangement, and the guy asks the guy who hired him and says, how are you going to pay me the $200? How are you going to come up with the $200,000 to pay me? And the guy looked at him and says, I don't know. That's for you to worry about. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually have somebody worry for us? But the truth is, we do have somebody that will worry for us. 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your cares, all your anxieties on him. Why? Because he cares. Third one is that I think is a peace barrier in our lives is regrets, that we live with past regrets. And past regrets can easily keep us from living in the present. God intended that we can certainly learn from our past, but we don't have to live in it. We can't live in it. And so sometimes we have to deal with the regrets in our lives. And then the last one is unresolved conflict keeps us in turmoil and keeps us from having peace in our life. I don't know about you. Just a couple weeks ago, I experienced some conflict with somebody that needed to be resolved. And I was just not calm for weeks. I was just in turmoil until that got resolved. And there's so many people that live a life of conflict in their relationships where there is no peace. And there's a reason why God wants us to reconcile those relationships. It's not just for the relationships, but it's also so we can experience peace in our lives. There's a couple others that I think if we go deeper that people are dealing with that keep them from experiencing peace in our lives. And maybe it's something that you're experiencing, but there's things like for some, it's a secret life you're living. For some, you're carrying a secret life where maybe you're living in a way that is not what people see on the outside. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's a relationship that's not appropriate. Maybe it's a sort of heart issue that you're holding some bitterness and unforgiveness, or maybe it's even something illegal, whatever it is. But there's this angst and this anxiety and this lack of settling because you're holding on to all this stuff. For others, there's a issue that there's no peace with people that are on the sort of the performance treadmill, those that are into achievement, that their value and self-worth is completely based on what they can achieve in life, and that is a moving target, and so you're as good as your last success. And then for others, there's this maybe I would call it extreme self-obsession, that your life is one big selfie about you. And that your focus comes back to you and you're posturing and positioning constantly in life, trying to make it about you. And I can tell you this, there's no peace in that. So my question on this, because we're just skimming the tip of the iceberg here, but here's my question on all of these things. Where in your life do you need to calm down? Where in your life are you lacking peace? I'll ask in a different way, as Paul said, where do you need to become ambitious about making some changes in your life? I don't know, maybe it's the busyness that says, hey, it's not just a season of busyness, but it's a lifestyle of busyness, and I have to prioritize things in my life. Maybe I have to say no to good things. Or maybe it is worry and anxiety and you haven't given that over to God. Or maybe it needs counseling. Some anxiety and worry is pretty serious. And God does amazing things through counselors. Or maybe it's some past you have to deal with or some broken relationships that you got to go, man, I got to go back and resolve these things. I know it's super hard and it seems very difficult to think about, but maybe if you're living a secret life, that you need to bring that out into the light, because that is not easy, but it's a path to peace, because you don't have to work up holding it down anymore. I don't know what it is, but we have to ask that question because we have a responsibility to work on those things to help create peace in our life. So that first thing in terms of living a quiet life, living a peaceful life, is we have to calm down. The second one is that we have to keep out. We have to keep out. And what I mean by keeping out is we have to keep out or stay out of other people's business. Anybody know what a busybody is? Anybody sitting next to a busybody? No, I'm just kidding about that. Don't raise your hand on that. Busybody is somebody who meddles or pries into other situations. Most of us have heard that term, right? Mind your own business, but I don't know if you realized it, but right here, this is a term that was in Scripture. Verse 11 that I just read, what Paul says, he says, mind your own business. Mind your own business. Now, when you look at minding your own business, there's two aspects to minding your own business. There's staying out of other people's business, and then there's focusing on what you need to focus on. Let's just look at the staying out of other people's business. I would ask the question, okay, Paul, aren't we supposed to be in other people's business at appropriate times? Aren't we supposed to get involved in situations at different times? Are we supposed to just mind our own business for everything? And the answer to that is no. We should get in. There are things that we should get involved in. There are situations in our life that we need to be involved in. We need to stand up and fight injustices and stand up for justice. It's extremely important that we get involved in that. We need to stand up for our faith in a culture when it clashes against our faith. We need to stand up about God's truth in this world. That's important to do. We need to stop when there's opportunity to help somebody that's in need, even if they're not asking. It's important for us. We can't just go by and say, hey, well, good luck to you. I mean, there's times we have to be involved, and thank God people get involved at different times. Think about a couple of months ago, I had an aunt who lives in Montana, my dad's youngest sister. And she lived alone. She was widowed, but she was still driving, and she would go back and forth to town. She lived right outside of Yellowstone. And she drove 30 miles into town every single day, and would go to church every week there. But anyway, a couple months ago, she was driving in a snowstorm going into town, and a semi-truck going the other way hit black ice and hit her head on. And she was going to die. I'll just say that. And the engine pushed into her and the dashboard, and she was sitting on the side of the road. And the paramedics, it took them an hour to get there because of the weather. But she was still alive. And a woman, a mom with 3 kids, driving a minivan the same direction that she was going, pulled over in that weather on the side of the road and went and stayed with her till the paramedics got there. And gave her a blanket because she was cold, talked to her about her kids, got to convey some messages to my kids, to my cousins. And that act of getting involved changed, not that it was easy for my cousins dealing with losing their mom in such a tragic way, but I'll tell you this, they got a gift because they knew their mom didn't die alone and that she got to hear the words from their mom about things they would have never known. So thank God people get involved. There are things that we are called to get into other people's business that we should, but Paul is really specific here about the flip side of that, and that is there's things we should not get into in terms of other people's business. In fact, he goes as far to say, hey, if you want peace in your life, you got to have some wisdom and know when to stay out of people's business. That's what he's saying here. And if you wonder, hey, what are those things that is getting into other people's business? I'll give you a couple of qualifiers there. Number one is judging others is getting into other people's business. If we start to go down the path of somebody's life and we start to make judgments on somebody's life, we're probably crossing a line and getting involved where we shouldn't get involved. And that's a hard issue for all of us that we have to ask ourselves. Judgment is a really, really big thing. I was, a couple years ago, before my father passed away, lived in Southern Oregon, and we'd go up and visit him. And every Saturday, we would go to the farmer's market there in town, just hang out at the farmer's market. Farmer's markets are interesting because you go there because you think, I'm going to get fresh vegetables and fruit at farmer's markets. I always end up getting donuts. I'm not sure why, but I end up with the donuts. Like the vegetables, I want donuts. So I'm sitting there at one of these markets this Saturday morning by myself, and it's busy. And this guy is standing on the corner as the busiest traffic through the farmer's market, and he has a sign. And this sign he's holding up says, abortion is murder, and if you have an abortion, you're going to hell. That was the sign. That's what the sign said. And what struck me most about that sign is those last words. You are going to hell. No grace, no redemption, no forgiveness, just hate. And what blew me away as I was sitting there is there was a woman who set up a table very strategically, a donation table right next to him. And it was a woman that was part of an organization that has been very much overtly sort of promotes living kind of in conflict to biblical principles. I'll just say that they're just really promoting a lifestyle that has non-biblical principles. And as she sat there and put these donations out there to kind of ask for donations, every time people walked by that he would say something or wave that sign, people would donate to her organization. It was an amazing dynamic. And as I watched it, there was another gentleman that was a Christian who was not affiliated with the guy with the sign that came up and started to talk to the woman that was at the table and kind of semi-apologized, like, hey, this is not how all Christians are. Hey, I'm sorry, this is not what we support. And this woman's response was, hey, don't apologize. We love this guy. She says, we follow him around everywhere he goes, and we get the greatest support every time he opens his mouth. It's funny and sad at the same time. See, I'm not saying we should definitely stand up for God's truth when it comes to things like abortion, but I'll tell you this, it's also in the how we do it that is so critical. It's how we do it. See, because we have one of two choices. We can either compel people to faith or we can repel them. And we have to ask ourselves when we're judging, are we compelling or repelling? Another one, when you think about being in other people's business, is sharing our opinions on everything when it's not really necessary, right? I mean, let's face it, we live in a culture, and when you think about social media, it's an opinion factory, right? And so there's so many things out there with social media, and social media is really confusing in a lot of ways. As good as it is, it has its challenges, but if you think about it with social media, it's unprecedented because everybody's open for business on social media. I mean, people share their business out there all the time. I mean, from the mundane of what I ate for dinner last night to how I slept to what vacation I went on, fine. There's all that. But then people start to share their deeper, more controversial opinions there. And it's easy for people to get sucked into, well, I need to respond and share my opinions about those things too. And you have to ask ourselves, we all do, is that necessary? To what end are we asking this? Are we responding to this? Because it's easy, media is 100% built on controversy. Engagement, following, all those things is built on this because it gets people talking. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I can tell you this, we can find ourselves getting into things that are very much more destructive than they are helpful. And then the third one, when Paul says minding our own business, I think the third one that's a big one is gossip. I think gossip is a cancer. We know it, it's human nature, but we have to be fire breaks when it comes to gossip. Because getting into other people's business, if we're perpetuating other people's business to other people, we're swimming where we shouldn't be swimming. I think for me, when I look at minding my own business, I think there's some qualifiers that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to this that helps us to know when we're crossing a line or not. And I'll just put 4 questions up there that we should ask when we look at our engagement with people as far as kind of meddling in other people's business. The first one is am I forcing my personal convictions all the time? Am I always pushing my agenda? If you're a person that you think everybody is hanging on every word you say and want to hear your opinion, you're probably going to be in situations where you're getting involved where you shouldn't. Am I looking down or condemning somebody? Like I said, judging others, we know when we start getting into people's business and start judging them for it, we probably need to look inside and go, wow, is this something I need to be doing? Am I engaged in gossip? I talked about that one. And then the last one is, am I more focused on the shortcomings of others than my own? It's easy to start focusing on everybody else and just start ignoring our own. Scott had this great message last week, and if you were here, you probably were part of that, where he told everyone, hey, look to the right or left and tell the person you're a sinner. And said that there was this guy that was having great fun at the 9 o'clock service. He's looking in front of him and in back of him. He's pointing people across the room, you're a sinner. And I think that was so funny, but it's also so poignant because so often that's what we do is we want to point fingers at everybody else, but we don't look at ourselves. And if we're doing more of that, we probably have to look at how am I engaging with people and am I in places that I need to remove myself from? So here's a question on this second point. A couple questions. One is, are there relationships where you feel like, hey, maybe I'm in where it's none of my business and I need to pull back? Maybe there's several. Are you a person in general that says, hey, maybe I get into people's business too much and I need to pull back? And all of us need to assess our ambition, again, goals, focus, work on building discernment of when to get in, what to get involved in, how to get involved in that, and whether or not I should be involved in it at all. Because we need a lot of wisdom in that to know what those appropriate sort of interactions are. So Paul says, if you do that and you can get that discernment, you can live a more peaceful life. So living this life of peace, it starts with us calming down. And then the second one is it needs to be that we keep out of certain people's business and know when to get involved. The last one is that we just need to focus in. We need to focus in. So when you think about focusing in, as I said before, there's the side of staying out of people's business, but there's also the side that we need to focus in on our business. That's what wasn't happening in the church at Thessalonica. And so when I say our business, it's inside and outside. Certainly looking at our internal selves, but also the world God put us in around us, that we've got to be looking at what is my business in the world that God put us here for. See, the church, when Paul says, he says, mind your own business and work with your hands so you're not dependent on anybody. What he means by that, he's saying, is that don't rely on somebody else to do the work that God called you to do in every aspect of your life. In your job, in your family, in your neighborhood, in your school, in your church. He says, we have all been uniquely given gifts, and you need to mind that business. Don't rely on somebody else to do that, is what he's saying. Think of it this way. We have been given this amazing life that God gave us, and we're called to steward that life in the best that we can, to give everything we can to steward the life God gave us. And I would say this, and this is sort of in the context of what Paul is saying here in his faith, how faith plays a part in that, is minding our own business is about being about our Father's business. Minding our business is about being about our Father's business, meaning using everything God has given me and making my business my Father's business. I think it's incredible that so much of the backbone and foundation of ministry, whether it's here or outside of here, happens from people who are minding their own business by minding their Father's business, and they're doing it with quiet service. In other words, the people aren't seeing it happening, but what's happening is amazing things are happening because of their service. They're like unsung heroes that are happening out there. I think about it, if you've ever been down to our clothes closet and you've seen the amazing gift of people coming on Saturdays and getting all those clothes, and I had somebody come down there a couple weeks ago and said, I was blown away, like, this is like a store. This is beautiful. What people don't realize is there's a small group of people every Tuesday that are going through thousands upon thousands of articles of clothing to make that beautiful. I mean, that's an unsung hero. That's a team that has been doing this faithfully. I think about Common Ground. You know, one of the passions for our food and clothing ministry on Saturday mornings is that people are going to experience breakfast there, a meal that they can sit down, and not with paper plates and paper cups, but we want to give dignity with real plates and glasses and coffee cups. But in order to make that happen, that people experience that dignity, there's people who are washing dishes constantly through the whole morning to make that a beautiful place for people. Unsung heroes. I think about our memorial services where people come dealing with one of the hardest things you could ever experience in life, and that's a loss of a loved one. And there's a couple of individuals, I think 2 or 3, that every single week are washing tablecloths so that they can decorate there and make it special for the families of what it means to them for their loved one. And they're doing it every week. Got people in the back in our memorial garden. If you've ever been back there, what a beautiful place to reflect on a loved one and to be close to God and experiencing peace. We have a couple of people that are dedicated to making that place beautiful out there, whether it's the landscaping, the water, the weeding, whatever it is. So somebody walks out there and they experience something that you can't even imagine. What about our landscapers around here doing just week in and week out, maintaining the building and the grounds around here to make God's house a beautiful place and also making it a safe place? The list goes on, and it's all because of people minding their business by minding their Father's business. You know, it doesn't even have to be just here in ministry and grandiose things that we do. It's everyday life. Ministry happens in every aspect of our lives. And for all of us, minding our business and our Father's business is also in the everyday life that we have. It's showing up at work and how you are on your job, right? Your work ethic, your integrity, how you deal with your coworkers. People are watching that. It's in your family of how you show up as a husband or a wife or a brother or sister or child, parent. It's how you show up at school and with your friends and how your work ethic is in school or your social gatherings and your friends or how you do around the church. It's all of those things and the everyday things that is our business that we can make our Father's business because people are watching. And it's hard to talk to somebody about faith if we're not a living example of it. It's just really hard to do. I'm not saying we have to be perfect, but if we're really off base on that, it's hard to be an influence on people without our living example of that. That's the most powerful influence, is our example of how we live taking care of our business. Parents will know that. If you're a parent or you've heard this as a child, you ever say to your kids, do as I say, not what as I do, right? Remember that? I remember my daughter when she was in high school. I was taking her to school one day and it was crowded, so I was sitting at the stop sign and we're kind of creeping along there. And she started talking about a couple kids in her class. And it was gossip. And she's talking away, and hey, they're doing this and doing that. And I stopped her and I said, hey, you should be talking, I don't need to hear this stuff, and you shouldn't be talking about other people because that's gossip. And she didn't miss a beat, and she looked at me and said, really? Well, you do it all the time at home. And it struck me so strongly that I threw her out of the car, made her walk the rest of the way to school. No, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. You know, the Apostle Paul said this very succinctly in verse 12 when he talks about living this life that's quiet and living it in a way. He says, why do we do this? So we can affect those outsiders, so we can be an influence on the outsiders that are watching us, that our lives would be a reflection of those on the outside. That's why. That's the amazing opportunity we have by minding our business, by minding our Father's business. Last thing, just thought here is, you know, I think that when we think about this life, minding our Father's business, I don't think there's any greater way to experience peace in our lives. And I don't think there's any better definition for the good life when we're minding our Father's business. And so my question to you on this is, what are you focused on in this life? Maybe it's your brand. Maybe it's focus more about what you need to do in this life, what you need to get in this life, how people see you, and it's all about building your life around you. Maybe it's that. Maybe your focus is on others, what they're doing or not doing in life. I don't know. Or maybe it's trying to get out of this world everything that you possibly can to experience peace and the good life. You know, the Bible and all of those things, the Bible says you will never be satisfied if you pursue it that way. I want to show you this picture. Some of you probably know, if you grew up in the Bay Area, this is a Winchester Mystery House. And I lived right down the street from it. Anybody ever been there? Ever go there? Yeah, everybody. Yeah. A lot of people moved up from the Bay Area, right? Interesting thing about the Winchester Mystery House, so it was owned by Sarah Winchester, who was the widow of Charles Winchester, who created the repeating Winchester rifle, so it made a lot of money. And so she bought this house in 1884. It was very small at that time, and she started building from the minute she moved into the house. And over 39 years, almost 40 years, the house was under construction constantly. Here's the thing of why she did that. Because Sarah Winchester had no peace in her life. And she loved architecture and building, and so she was trying to find peace in her life, so she'd just keep adding rooms and adding buildings. At one time, there was 500 rooms in this house. And so because of all of her erratic behavior trying to find peace, she would start projects, start and stop different projects, different walls added, leaves things in there. And that's why if you go there, you will see stairways that just hit walls and doors that open and lead to nowhere. Here's the thing in our own lives, friends, is that all of us are building something in our lives. And our life is a construction project through the whole course of our lives. It just is. And we all are looking for peace in our life. We're all looking for purpose in our life. And we're all looking for meaning in our life. But so many people, friends, are pursuing things that end up just being doors that lead to nowhere. And there's one, though, that the promise is, there's one door that says is if you go through my door, you will have everything you've ever been looking for. And that's Jesus himself. In fact, Jesus himself said in John 10:9, he says, I am the door. I am the door. And that if anyone enters by me, he will be saved and he will find pasture. There is no greater promise and no greater peace and no greater good life than a life that Jesus Christ is the center of your life. That is the promise. Let's pray.